Before she died, my grandmother confessed to me where she really came from. I almost believed her. My grandmother was a very private woman, even when it came to her own family. She was a German girl, born in Silesia around 1925 or so. That's about all we ever got to know. All she wanted us to know. I suppose the war was particularly cruel to her and she lost whatever family she had. She never spoke of anything before the winter of 45-46, when she met my grandfather, a GI stationed in Bavaria. She'd been trekking west, away from the Red Army, like so many other refugees. A whirlwind romance ensued, and she came back with him to the States in early 47, though I'm sure the desire to get out of a shattered, conquered nation that held nothing more for her played as big a role as her love. Not that I begrudge her that. She was a very smart young woman, brighter than my grandfather, as he freely admitted. Once in the US, she attended university for a few years, studying physics. Grandfather used to claim she actually knew John Wheeler and Hugh Everett, but she didn't much like to talk about. In the early 1950s, she abruptly dropped her studies and decided to settle into the role of a proper American housewife. Grandfather himself discouraged her, saying she shouldn't waste a brain like that, but she said she was happy with him and didn't need to change the world to be satisfied. So that was that. My father was born in 1960. He met my mother in 1990, and in 1999 I was never especially close with either set of grandparents. And these, my paternal grandparents, lived in another state, so even less so. And on top of that was my grandmother's aforementioned private nature. But grandmother and I did share one thing, a passion for history, even though she'd studied physics in university and was a math whiz. History was her real. She imparted a love of the past to me, and when we visited, she and I would spend much time talking about Napoleon's armies, German foreign policy between Bismarck and the Great War, the Bolshevik Revolution. You get the idea. She had a seriously impressive memory. She'd read a book once and then recount every detail from it with perfect accuracy. When I was about 12, my grandfather passed, and grandmother, sick with cancer, moved to live with us. Only a year or two later, her brilliant mind sadly began to go. We still talked history often, but she began to make mistakes that she never would have a decade ago. She referenced battles that never were, states that never existed, generals who never commanded. I remember once discussing the Great War and her offhandedly mentioning the Red Army's investment of Prague. I gently reminded her that Lenin's westward offensive in 1919 had been halted at the gates of Warsaw. The Bolsheviks had never reached Prague. She nodded. Right? Right. She mentioned Alfred Hugenberg, who she called the last Chancellor of capitalist Germany. I reminded her that Hugenberg had never been Chancellor. He'd been sidelined by the Nazis soon after their takeover and faded into irrelevance. She nodded. Right, in 2014, grandmother went into hospice. It became clear she didn't have much time left. She was about 90. After all, no, we never did know her precise age, not even her birthday. As I said, she did not talk about life before my grandfather. We were all sad, of course, but it was a sort of rigid, austere sadness. That was our relationship with her. She wouldn't have wanted a lot of blubbering and sappiness. One day, I think this would have been maybe October of 2014, right about the start of my sophomore year of high school, we went in to visit her. As the doctors said, her condition had worsened markedly. We sat with her for a while, and then she asked if she could perhaps see us all, me, my father, my mother, and my two sisters individually for a bit. That was fine, of course. I came last. When I stepped back into the room and sat by her bedside, she asked me if I still liked history. I said of course, and it was true. I still do. She told me she didn't have much time left. I said, sure, I know. I think I was her favourite grandchild because we're both pretty frank like that. She asked me if I'd do her a favour. Of course, I said sure. Grandmother told me to go home, and to go to her room and take down the old oak chest in her closet, bring it to her as soon as I could. I did just that. It was an old heavy thing she'd brought with her from Germany decades ago. It wasn't even locked, but she hadn't told me I could open it, and I didn't want to overstep while she was dying. The next day, after school, I caught a bus to the hospital, chest in hand. I brought it to her and she beamed. She asked me to open it. I did. There were a few things inside. Sitting on the very top was a photograph of a pretty young woman I didn't recognise. Black and white, but fine quality. I wasn't too surprised when she told me it was her, but I was surprised that she was in uniform. It wasn't a uniform I recognised. Her hair was pulled back into a braid. She was smiling, and her arms were clasped behind her back, so that I couldn't make out the insignia on her shoulder, only its fringes. I could make out some narrowed point and two convergent lines. Maybe some sort of flower shoulder patch? Grandmother, what uniform is this? Lift the next item. It was heavy and wrapped in a bundle of greasy old rags. I nearly dropped it when I saw it was a pistol. I quickly shoved it back into the box and peeked over my shoulder. I'm pretty sure firearms are not allowed inside the hospital. Grandmother, why do you have a weapon here? My old service weapon. Weapon? She never quite suppressed the German accent. What service were you in? You were a soldier? A soldier for who? I'm going to tell you a story I don't think you will believe. But perhaps these things in the box will make it easier for you to believe. She told me point blank that she was not from this world. She had been born in Silesia in the late 1920s, she said, but not our Silesia, and not our 1920s. I won't go into the minutiae of the timeline she described to me, because we must have sat there for hours as she went over it. And as she did, she sounded entirely lucid and not the least bit senile. The gist of it was that, as in our world, the Nazis had risen to power in Germany. But World War II had begun a few years late. Hitler steamrolled Europe, just as he did in our world. Except, and this was the great point of divergence, he then steamrolled the USA, too, some years later, in the early 1950s, after years of grinding down the British economy and battering its famed navy. The Nazis managed at last to pull off the impossible an invasion and occupation of the British Isles. My grandmother said she had been active in the resistance to the Nazis long before Hitler ever took power. She fled Germany and went to Soviet Russia when the fight could no longer be continued at home. Thence to Britain, when the Wehrmacht conquered the USA. When Britain fell, she and thousands of others who could not countenance living under the Nazi boot ran further to South Africa in hopes of carrying on the struggle from there. I asked her what the uniform was then. She said it was the uniform of the Joint Committee of Military Sciences, a collaborative research and development effort between the governments in exile of Britain and France, and a number of other countries fighting Nazi Germany. Since she had been a student of physics, she was recruited for the JCMs. Days grew darker still. The Nazis seized old French Africa and used it as a springboard to assault South Africa and beyond. Victory for the Allies became a pipe dream. But for one man, a Russian scientist, my grandmother said. She did not name him. But she said that he was brilliant. Perhaps the most intelligent man to ever live. He discovered that there are other worlds, perhaps infinitely many worlds, running parallel to each other through eternity. And what's more, he discovered how to move between them. Grandmother told me to take the papers out of the box. They were thin, onion skin papers, the type people use to sketch schematics. They were covered in wild, impossible equations and intricate blueprints. It meant nothing to me. I was a kid struggling to keep a C in Algebra 2. This was the plan. She'd said their world, my grandmother's world, was lost. They could fight no more. So they would send someone, a single person, that was all the great Russian scientists' primitive machine could handle, into another world. Our world. This world, our world, they designated World 38. Ours was a world that had defeated the Nazis and so knew what horrors a Nazi victory would bring. My grandmother would be sent with the blueprints for the good doctor's machine. Once here, she would convince our generals and statesmen of her mission, and with the help of the great scientists of World 38, improve the transporter so that it could bring through not only one person, but millions. Once this was done, the armies of our world could march into hers and liberate it forever from Nazi tyranny. She had stepped into the machine, she said, as artillery shells rained down on Johannesburg and the Waffen-SS battered at the gates. Her colleagues would destroy the machine as soon as she was through. They could not risk it falling into the hands of the Nazis. Only the schematics, which she would bring with her to World 38, would remain. She had stepped into the machine, knowing full well that she might die, or worse. She had saluted her comrades. The room shook under the payload of Nazi warplanes. But it did work. She stepped out in spring 1945 of our world. The Third Reich was crumbling. Hitler had shot himself. The Allies were rushing deep into Germany. Horrible, replete with death, but for her a near utopia. Now she had a mission to reconstruct the doctor's machine. To liberate her. That was why she had come to America, she said, though, she insisted. She did love my grandfather. That was why she had sought out the wisdom of great physicists at America's vaunted universities. But it was hopeless. No one would believe her, no one would take her seriously. Not even Everett, the father of the many-world interpretation, seriously considered the plans for her fantastic machine. So in the end, she gave up, settled in for a quiet life with my grandfather. I believed her. I did. How could I not? She was an old woman. She did not make up stories, not to tease her grandchildren. The tears in her eyes were certainly real. And how else would I account for the photograph of her in the uniform? The blueprints. My heart broke for her. It was no wonder she had been so sullen, so private, all her life. Out there somewhere there was a world, her world, suffering under the most terrible despotism. It had been her great commission to rescue it. She had been her people's last hope. And she'd failed. Were they still languishing under the jackboot, awaiting an interdimensional rescue that would never come? But she told me, and gripped my wrist tight. It may still come. Listen to me. I will be dead. Very soon, but not you. Take the plans. Take the box, she begged. Please, one day see that the machine is built. You must. Whatever it takes. Billions of women and children across eternity beg rescue. Please, do not fail like I did. Liberating a parallel universe from Nazi occupation is a hell of a responsibility to lay on a 15-year-old kid. But she did it, and all choked up, what could I say? Except, I'll try, grandmother, there was one more thing in the box. Another stack of papers, covered in flowery German handwriting. What are these? She sat up sharply in her hospital bed when she saw them. Immediately she tried to play it off, and relaxed again. But I noticed the brief shock. They are my private writings, she said, attempting nonchalance. Please, burn them, and do it soon. I do not wish for them to survive me. Sure, grandmother, I said goodbye. I embraced her, tears in my eyes. She died 5 days later. I did not know what to do. She swore me to secrecy, until such a time as I could reasonably expect to build this great machine. Again, I was 15 years old. I certainly wasn't going to be ripping holes in space-time out of my bedroom and in between debate tournaments. As the weeks went by and her body went into the ground, I became less sure if I believed her. I did not disbelieve her. But it was all insane. Perhaps she was just going mad with age. And yet I must have spent hours poring over those blueprints. They never became any clearer. All those numbers, square roots, wild calculations, might have been the height of genius, or might have been absolute nonsense. I couldn't say. Years went by. I never forgot, but there was little I could do, so I put it aside. Until recently, I'm in my 4th year of university, now, near graduation. With apologies to my grandmother, I did not major in physics. I was not thinking of my grandmother's tale until only some weeks ago. I was working on a term paper examining 20th century European dictatorships. Of course, first and foremost in the discussion are Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union. An entire subsection of the paper, I promise this is relevant, is dictatorships and euphemisms. For example, when it came to the Nazis, herding together terrified women and children, marching them into freshly dug pits, mowing them down by the hundreds. And burying their still twitching corpses is merely a special action. For the Bolsheviks under Stalin, the invasion of Poland or the Baltic states, the execution of tens of thousands of teachers, officers, priests, writers and farmers, the deportation of tens of thousands more into bleak Siberia, the imposition of totalitarian state machinery and the suppression of all dissent, is liberation. It was flipping through such morbid sources that my grandmother returned suddenly and sharply to my mind. I carried the little box with me, always, unbeknownst to my parents, my siblings, or anyone else, and it hit me. I was in university now. I might not be a physicist myself, but there were plenty of brilliant mathematicians on campus. At least a few I knew who had published on multiverse theories. If my grandmother wasn't insane, if I really did have some duty to free her home world, where better to start building this grand machine than here? I went to my apartment closet and retrieved the box, which I had not opened in years. The first thing that caught my eye were her private writings. I was ashamed to think I had not burned them when she asked, but I could not bring myself to do so. Some deep-seated instinct held me back. I was going to go to a certain professor of physics, who I knew to be a self-proclaimed many-worlder, and try to broach all of this insanity gently, and see where I got. But my grandmother's private writings returned again and again to my thoughts. Finally, I decided I was going to read them. I asked her forgiveness from beyond the grave, but I rationalised that I needed to know exactly what was going on. Her writings might illuminate things. Except that I couldn't read them. They were in German, and in a florid hand that would have made even English difficult for me. So I took them instead to a girl I knew, a friend of a friend really, fluent in German, a foreign languages major. She asked me what they were and pointed out that they looked old. I told her it was a speculative fiction work, written from the point of view of a young woman sent from a world nearly conquered by the Nazis to ours in hopes of rescuing her own universe. She asked if I could clearly write fluently in German what I needed her for. I told her I hadn't written it. She asked how I knew what it was about if I hadn't written it. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I asked her to please just tell me what it said, so she began to read. She finished quickly. There were only about 5 pages. She looked back up at me, rather nonplussed, kind of bored. She thought it was just a story after all. Well, it doesn't seem like it's written in a world where Hitler wins, she said. It looks like it's written in a world where Stalin wins. That threw me for a loop. I got a pit in my stomach. I asked her to elaborate. She told me it was a letter written by a general of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to a subordinate, one Comrade Colonel Maria Messer. My grandmother. So these weren't my grandmother's private writings at all. Rather, they were writings addressed to her. This girl told me that it seemed, in the world of the story, somehow, the Soviet Union had established control over all of the planet. There was reference to Mexican, Yoruba, German, Kurdish, Japanese, and even New England Soviet republics. There was not enough information to reveal precisely how this had come to pass, but somehow mankind was subject to a globe spanning Stalinist dictatorship. I still hardly understood. My grandmother had lied to me about the world from which she'd come. Why? My grandmother, a colonel of Stalin's secret police. I asked her to read on, hands sweating. She said the letter spoke nothing of bringing armies from our world to liberate hers. Rather, it spoke of bringing armies from her world into ours. I remembered the photograph of my grandmother in her uniform. I could picture the fringes of the insignia sewn onto her sleeve, mostly hidden by the angle of the camera, and I realised what it was. A narrowed point and 2 converging lines. It was the edge of a red star, enclosing a hammer and sickle. And at last, I realised. I'd been played for a fool. I realised there had never been any Nazi-ruled dystopia. I realised why my grandmother had wanted me to burn these papers as soon as I could, why she had not wanted me to read them. I realised why she so badly wanted this great machine built. Because the letter finished thusly: remember, Comrade Messer, the world you are going into is one still stuck firmly in the age of capitalist darkness. This shall be the fifth world besides our own, we free forever from the strictures of capitalist production. I cannot stress enough the importance of the machines being built to specifications. We sent you through on a prototype. But the machine whose construction you oversee in World 38 must be exponentially superior. It must be capable of bringing through from our world at the very least. Several hundred fronts worth of Red Army soldiers, some 500 million men under arms. This, our analysts estimate, will be the minimum necessary for the military defeat of World 38. The liquidation of all class enemies and counter-revolutionaries, estimated to be some 200-300 million total. The pacification of all hostile populations. And finally, the true and total liberation of this world and its peoples. Much luck, comrade.